Hi there, I'm Karina Veaudry, a lifelong conservationist and a native plant landscape architect for the past 32 years. Most importantly, though, I've been a long-term member of the Florida Native Plant Society, supporting the mission of preservation and restoration of native plants and native plant ecosystems. It's really important and meaningful thing for me. I have used the information and resources from the Native Plant Society to complete successful projects and write landscape ordinances. And it's my personal goal in life to work with like-minded individuals and organizations to promote the planting of native plants in residential backyards, condominium and apartment patios, and business landscapes to preserve biodiversity and the habitat that's needed for birds, pollinators, and other wildlife to survive into the future. So this is part one of a three-part series of me sharing everything I've learned throughout the years, and I'll be taking questions afterwards.
So let's just talk about native plants. What is a native plant? Native plants are those plants which have existed without human impacts over millennia and have developed complex interrelationships with other plants, the soil, and insects. And they are uniquely adapted to our environment without the need for cultivation, irrigation, or fertilizer. That's an important point. The only reason people have fertilizer in Florida is because plants that are native to other areas, like loropetalum or ligustrum, oleander, they're typically not suited for our sandy and unique soils. Not all of our soils in Florida are sand, but we have very unique soils. And to try to put a plant that's native to China, maybe because we like the bloom, and have it grow in our soils is very difficult. That's why we have to provide the fertilizer, because there's not a lot of nutrients in our soil. However, our native plants are perfectly adapted and thrive in our Florida soils. So I want to talk a little bit more about how unique our native Florida plants are. Florida contains 18% of the indigenous plants in the United States. There are approximately 15,300 indigenous plants in the United States. We have 2,800 of those plants right here in Florida. Florida contains 7% of the world's number of indigenous plants to geographic regions. Think about that. 7% of the indigenous plants to a geographic region are contained right here in the peninsula of Florida. So what's a non-native plant? Non-native plant, it is an exotic plant. They're typically innocuous. In other words, they don't do damage. They're just non-native. A good example is a crepe myrtle. It's native to Southeast China. Now, there are birds and butterflies and insects that are looking for that crepe myrtle in China to have an ecological relationship with and use it as food and nesting. Here, it's not native to North America. So we call ecologically sterile. It provides no ecological benefit here. So that's a non-native plant. So I'll talk about the incredible diversity of Florida. In Florida, we have 4,143 vascular plant species, 2,825 native, and 1,318 naturalized plants, which means they've been here so long, over millennia, they have naturalized into our environment. Something really important to mark is that 1 in 12 of our native plant species are endemic. 228 to be exact. Endemic means they're native to here and they occur nowhere else in the world. So that is incredibly special. Of our 2,825 native plants, 437 are endangered. We have 114 threatened species, and we have 8 that are commercially exploited. Commercially exploited means legally we get a permit, and companies can go and pick palmettos and palmetto berries to make vitamins and herbal supplements. And Also, Lyonia ferruginea is picked and removed from our forest for cut flower arrangements. Now, the problem with that, there's not a problem with that. The problem is over harvesting. Right now, we don't have any scientific studies that tell us the number of carrying capacity. For instance, the palmetto berries are a primary food staple for our unique indigenous black bear. And so we don't know how much we're taking away of those food sources. So that's something that needs to be studied. We're also one of the most unique places in the world. Biogeographically speaking, we have the most number of native plant communities of practically anywhere on Earth. We have 82 plant communities in Florida. Compare that to maybe some ecosystems out west or over in Europe. They may have 6 in their biogeographical region. We have 82, something very interesting and special to note. Also, water. Florida is a lot of water. We have 7,800 lakes, 1,700 streams, and really incredibly, we have 27 first magnitude springs. A first magnitude spring is a spring that puts out 66 million gallons of water per day. Sounds like a lot of fresh water, right? Well, us Floridians use for, washing dishes, showers, drinking water, 7.2 billion gallons of water per day. The highest per capita use of water of anywhere else in the world, mainly because we use drinking water to water our lawns. So all of that incredible biodiversity of our plants, our different, wetlands, streams, marshes, supports a whole plethora of biodiversity in Florida. We have 700 terrestrial vertebrates, 35,000 invertebrates, and really interesting, we have 410 endemic vertebrates known only to occur here in Florida, 16 endemic fish, 26 endemic herps, and 9 endemic birds, and 3 endemic mammals. Again, occurs nowhere else in the world, and all of that wildlife needs native plants to survive and live. But due to habitat destruction, and when we do build in Florida, if we build 3,000 houses at a time, what do? We are taking away the native plants, we take out the trees, and when we put back our houses and businesses, we put back crepe myrtles, which are native to China, St. Augustine grass blanketed with no place for insects or native plants to take root, laura petal, the non-exotic, the non-native list goes on and on. So think about those little songbirds. Speaking of birds, we have sandhill cranes. So when we landscape our homes, the developer's going to put in the least expensive plant material possible. And what is that? Sod. So we blanket our subdivisions with grass. It's the least expensive thing to put in, but it's the most expensive thing to maintain. And also what grass does, it's a monoculture, and it excludes, any other type of biodiversity and plants. So the more we can reduce our lawn size, put some native plants back in, the more we're helping insects, which is helping birds and other wildlife to eat and to survive. So by planting native plants, businesses and citizens can provide a sense of place. Those plants are very unique to your area. You can eliminate fertilizer and the resultant runoff pollution. You can reduce or eliminate insecticides and the killing of beneficial insects. Doug Tallamy has a quote that it takes over 3,000 caterpillars and insects to feed one nest of 3 nestlings. So we really need to increase the biodiversity of our residential landscapes and provide food and shelter. Native plants are very specialized. They have specialized relationships with the birds and insects, and we've found that there are more breeding pairs of birds when there's more native plants that are abundant in the neighborhood. This slide here is a slide borrowed from Doug Tallamy, and it really exemplifies the term specialized. Take a look at this caterpillar with a serrated edge on it. It's mimicking the serrated edge of that elm tree. Now, plants and trees, they don't like to be eaten, so they develop protective mechanisms like enzymes and stuff that doesn't taste good to eat or make the insects or people sick or maybe even kill an insect. So this insect is camouflaging itself so it doesn't get eaten by a bird while it's eating the elm leaf, which it has a specialized relationship with. Over millennia, it's developed a morphology to look like the leaf. Nature is incredible. Here is some more information on Doug Tallamy. This link will take you to a YouTube video that he very eloquently describes the need for more native plants and the need of insects in our United States to stop the extinction of bird species. And here are some quotes from different biologists, including Doug Tallamy. Insects are the key to restoring nature. The more insects that go extinct, the more flowers and plants that go extinct. 50% of bee species are extinct at this point. There's been a 96% decline in bee species in the last 20 years. It's an epidemic, and it's something that we all need to take responsibility for and get more native plants out there. Our bees are solitary bees in Florida. They nest by themselves and they have a specific host plant. They're looking for a specific native. Several bee species have larvae that can only eat on one or two species. If the more we remove native species from our environment, the more that these bees and other insects cannot survive. Right now, there are 432 species of North American birds that are threatened by extinction right now because of the lack of insects to feed them. Insects are the reason that birds migrate. They go from one area in Central America, they'll migrate across the Gulf of Mexico, and they'll come into Florida. And when they get here, they've lost 35% of their body weight just getting here with the migration. They need to land, they need to rest, and they need to eat and native plants and insects as soon as possible in order to survive. So the 9 suggestions from Doug Tallamy is to put more native plants. He has a theory that if everybody had native plants in their backyard, that's 40 million acres we can plant with native plants and have insect and bird species survive. So he recommends cutting your lawn in half. Plant for specialist insects that might have a special relationship with one special native plant. Keep leaf litter in place. The leaf litter and the bare spots of the dirt, that's insects and butterflies need contact with the soil. Without that contact, it's hard for them to survive. They extract nutrients and out of the soil. With our solid lawns, there's no way with all of that thatch for insects to be able to have that contact with the dirt that they need. Don't use security lights. If you have to have a security light, use something that has a motion detector. Lights attract and kill insects nightly on a daily basis. We're losing many of our species due to that. Oppose mosquito spraying. You can call your county and have them not spray on when they're passing by your house. These mosquito sprays, they kill everything. They kill every bug. It's a broad insecticide. It's dangerous and it's killing off a lot of our insects. And more importantly, get involved with your homeowner association. Make native plants, more prevalent in each neighborhood. Now I want to kind of take you through some imagery of our native ecosystems. We have Florida scrub, and a lot of our Florida ecosystems are pyrogenic communities, meaning they need fire to survive and not succeed into a different ecosystem. And that's a problem nowadays. The more populous we get, the smoke bothers a lot of people, so we can't do a lot of prescribed burns, which it builds up the fuel load. And then it also keeps the ecosystem unhealthy. Again, it needs that fire to regenerate. A lot of our wildflowers, don't even germinate until they've had that burn. A lot of our pine trees and scrub oaks are the same way. Beautiful pine flatwoods. Sometimes there's up to 500 ground cover species underneath the palmettos and wildflowers that you can't even see. Incredibly diverse species. And a lot of it in Florida, if you go out west to Montana, you can see, miles and miles of wildflowers. Our wildflowers in Florida are very unique. They're just in very small areas, and there's a lot of them, and they're very inconspicuous, but they provide a very important role in our ecosystems. Sandhills, a lot of sand and drainage, very unique plants and animals and insects and butterflies associated with this ecosystem. We have some of the most number of diverse water bodies in Florida. We have dry prairies, wet prairies, salt marshes. This is, again, very unique, and it supports very unique wildlife. Here's a springhead, again, unique in Florida, scrubby flatwoods. It goes on and on. Again, we have 82 plant communities in Florida. This slide is from a book called Priceless Florida that I highly recommend if you want to learn about Florida native ecosystems. It's by Bruce Means and his colleagues, and from this graphic you can see that from the darker colored areas on the map that Florida has the highest number of endangered species, the highest number of fish and other aquatic animals at risk, and the most number of plants at risk from being endangered or going extinct. So not only do we have the most specialized plants, but we have the most number of plants that are in peril. So what have we lost? 80% of our scrubs, 98% of our flatwoods and sandhills, 50% of our wetlands, and the remaining habitats are severely fragmented. And using Darlington rules and E.O. Wilson's estimate, right now we're losing, this is worldwide, 27,000 species per year, plants and animals. This is an unprecedented rate. This next slide is from the Thousand Friends of Florida, and it shows the population of Florida in 2005 and the population, the projected population for the year 2060. So here we are in 2005. This shows all of the red is the developed areas, the yellow is undeveloped or agriculture, and the green is existing conservation. So here's this next slide. You can see with the heavy red where we're going with our current development patterns. It's alarming to look at this, how much of our areas are going to be developed, and you can see the lack of conservation. We are conserving large landscapes, but not at the rate we're developing. Here's Central Florida before, here's after in 2016. Here, and again, here's side by side, here's Florida in 2005 and in 2060. You can see there's not much left. Right now, there's 100 million acres already approved in Tallahassee for develop, but not yet developed. So our population is going to soar. We need to be able to prepare for that. This slide shows an ideological map of ecological corridors in Florida. If we can preserve these ecological corridors so that big keystone mammals like the black bear and panther can we can have some space for them to migrate and roam. If we can protect those big keystone species, we can protect a whole plethora of other plants and animals. So we need to keep that in mind. We need to lobby our city and county governments to identify critical areas of conservation and plan for, conservation as long as we're developing, to try to balance that out. So here are black bear populations. They used to be all throughout Florida, but now there's only fragmented areas left. And I mentioned black bears in relation to native plants because if we can provide native plant corridors, and if bears can exist, so can a lot of our native plant ecosystems, and a lot of birds and a lot of other wildlife can survive with us, in harmony with us. Nobody is going to protect plants and animals but humans. They're defenseless, they're helpless. So unless we band together, create native plants in our yards so they have jumping off points for food in between large conservation areas, we can make a difference. Now we're going to talk about invasive plants. So the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council has identified, Category 1 plants. These are plants that are illegal to sell in Florida. They've done so much catastrophic damage to our ecosystems that they are on a Category 1 list. And here it is. It's pretty lengthy. Some plants to note are Nandina domestica. The obvious ones are Melaleuca, Brazilian pepper. Everyone's kind of heard of those. Australian pines. Everyone's kind of heard of those invasive plants that have done a lot of damage. But we still have nurseries and tree farms that are trying to sell some of these invasive plants. So citizens really have to educate themselves. On that Category 1 list are the orchid tree, Suriname cherries, ligustrum shrubs, sword ferns, Mexican petunia, a really big one. The exotic plant industry spent a lot of money to research to come up with a plant to change the DNA so it's not so invasive so we can still plant it. It's just crazy. Just with the 30,000 plants from all over the world that can be planted here, we just need to make a stand. Just stop trying to plant Mexican petunia. It's a problem plant. It destroys native areas. Schefflera, the oyster plant, the vitex tree. So a lot of these invasive plants, it takes a while for them to incubate, and then once they get loose into a natural area and birds take the berries and deposit them, and once it gets hold in a native forest, it spreads, it takes over all of the native vegetation, literally kills trees, shrubs, and ground covers. So the Category 2 invasive species list, it's not illegal to sell them yet, but we really should not be using them because they just haven't done the catastrophic damage yet, but they're on their way to doing that. So to stop the spread of invasive plants, stop planting wax begonias, fountain grass, coconut palms, the little kalanchoe succulent plants, bottle brush trees, queen palms, Wedelia, Washingtonian palms. Unfortunately, nurseries, even though they know that these are problem plants, they're still selling them because they're making money. So citizens can educate themselves by learning this list. Unfortunately, landscape architects have come a long way, and they're now pro-native plant. They're very ecologically oriented, but we have a handful of that profession who's responsible for still planting Washingtonian palms, queen palms. And so we all have a lot to do to move forward and create an atmosphere and participate. Don't purchase invasive species. Don't purchase Ardisia crenata, the coral Ardisia. Don't purchase Mexican petunia. Buy a native plant that looks similar. In Florida, I mentioned this earlier, we have the highest per capita use of water of any place else in the world. What a stigma to have. And that's because a lot of our drinking water goes to water lawns. Our subdivisions are full of lawns. We need to be able to cut our lawns in half, start planting native plants, and later on when we talk about landscape design, I'm going to give some really good hints on how to do that and fit in with your neighborhood. A lot of our neighborhoods, a lot of our subdivisions, you see these long chemical trucks come in, and spraying lawns. It's bad enough that there's lawns everywhere, but now we're adding insecticides to them. And again, we're killing out all of the beneficial insects when you do that. Spraying your lawn every month is not needed. They're just trying to sell a lot of chemicals. You do not need preventative insecticides to prevent bad insects from your lawn. That needs to stop. We spray 66 billion pounds of insecticides in Florida. It's no wonder any insects or wildlife survive that. And a lot of the times we're spraying herbicides as well to get those little weeds out of our lawn so it looks pristine monoculture. A lot of those weeds are native plants. Phylla nautaflora, it's a butterfly nectar plant, and it grows within lawns. And people are literally spraying and killing this native plant that supports butterflies just so that their lawn looks like artificial turf. So here's a picture of a traditional lawn. We see this all over our neighborhoods. This is the same house after being planted with native plants. Now, I always recommend that there's a little bit of a ground cover area that looks like turf, a turf substitute, so you fit in a little better. But this landscape is much more biodiverse and actually feeds birds and other wildlife. So the troubles with turf grass are when you landscape with turf and ornamentals, it harms biodiversity. It limits the diversity of native species in the areas dominated by turf and ornamentals. And it alters the surrounding natural environment. It changes your habitat. And this artificial environment provides little opportunity for native species to survive. So there's no habitat for wildlife, and vast amounts of land are devoted to this turf for growing urban lawns. One estimate indicates that there's 4 million acres of managed turf grass in Florida. 75% of these are residential lawns. A University of Florida study focusing on homes showed that 64% of our total water consumption use went to irrigation. If you have native plants, once they're established, you only need to water them once or maybe once a quarter to 6 times a quarter. You do not need regular irrigation on a native plant landscape. Lawn mowers alone burn 800 million gallons of gasoline a year. This slide is showing a functional lawn space. It's a small area of turf grass, and I call it functional because, if you have children or grandchildren or dogs, or if you want to entertain on a lawn, so you need a little bit of lawn space for that, but you do not need to blanket your entire property with lawn to have a functional lawn space. All of the other areas could be planted with native plants, like in this case. You also could turn your grass into a functional walkway, as in this slide, and then have your native plants on either side of it. There's a lot of different things you can do to reduce your grass. Now, Florida citizens are protected by Florida Statute 873, and I'll have that on a slide later on. This statute says HOAs and local governments do not have the right to tell a resident that they cannot plant drought-tolerant native plant species. So use that law if anyone ever tells you that you can't plant native plants in your yard. So this slide shows native plants at the edges of a lawn. You can group native plants, they can look beautiful, and you can have it in harmonious with a small lawn. This slide shows, native plants in clusters with different colors and textures. So now I want to we talked about lawns, now I want to talk about fertilizer damage from lawns. A lot of that runoff have been found in nearly every one of our springs. Our waterways are becoming polluted. Fertilizer runs off into every landscape. These photos are of the St. Johns River in Jacksonville. What fertilizers and nitrates do in water bodies is they eliminate the oxygen. So you're killing the aquatic species, and then you're killing off the waterfowl that feed on some of those aquatic species. So it's a whole chain of natural wildlife that we're killing off due to over-fertilizer usage. This is the St. Johns River at a larger scale of view, and this is just one of our waterways in Florida. It's significant damage we're doing with fertilizer runoff. Now this is the Caloosahatchee River, and you take a look at this. Nothing lives in this. This body of water got so bad with nitrates and fertilizers that it was literally deemed, this section of the river, dead. So, and here's a photo of our springs. This is the same spring back in 1992, and then in 2011. Look at the difference. We went from crystal blue water to a polluted waterway. We're literally destroying our waterways in Florida because we're fertilizing grass. The overuse of herbicides. This is a picture of a water pennywort. It's actually a native plant. It's really kind of an interesting plant with a round leaf. But people actually, it comes up in lawns pretty much because if you're overwatering St. Augustine grass, that's when this plant comes up. So if you stop overwatering, it naturally goes away because it's a wetland plant. But yet we're spraying herbicides and chemicals. So this is a picture of a traditional swale. Everybody's seen them in parking lots. Pretty much a grass swale to collect stormwater runoff. Well, this is a bioswale. Take a look at what we can have. We can create biodiversity even in a parking lot. We can have our walkways elsewhere, and then little frogs, birds can eat there. We need to start thinking about planting in every spot possible to turn back into a more biodiverse landscape for birds. This is a traditional retention pond. Everyone's seen them, right? It's grass right down to the edge, and how do they maintain it? They spray chemicals in the water, killing the fish. Migratory waterfowl that migrate here, they're going to drop into any body of water. Retention ponds are all over the place. So when they drop down, there's not only no food, no native plants, but there's chemicals in the water that make them sick or die. Now, this is a traditional landscape. This is an office park, and a lot of grass. You can see some foundation shrubs. Here's another view. That's a lot of work. This landscape, there's a lot of mowing every week in the summertime. There's edging, there's blowing. So there's a lot of work that goes into this traditional landscape. Now take a look at the building right next door. We landscaped this building with zero grass, no grass, and only native shrubs and trees. And take a look at this environment. Those employees can look out their window and see birds in their trees, see butterflies, see little curious little insects. And here's another slide of it. It's a very relaxed atmosphere. It's very harmonious. And most importantly, it's 83% less maintenance than that property next door with the traditional landscape and all of that sod. Now, 83% less means 83% less money and staff. You don't need all of that. This native plant landscape, maintains itself. It still needs a little bit of maintenance, but it's just a fraction of what the ornamental landscapes are. This is the back of the building. Here's the retention pond for that office building. This is a naturalistic pond. We put some shape to it so it mimics a pond in nature instead of straight edges. It does not go straight down. It has a littoral shelf so that native plants can grow on the edges and create habitat. There's a picnic table back there. What a lovely spot to have your lunch, surrounded with native trees and shrubs right on your lunch break. And compare that to a hot, open, grassy area. We need to be thinking more like this even for our businesses. Here's another retention pond on a project that won an award from the Florida Native Plant Society. And here's another one. I mean, it doesn't distract from your view. We have plenty of food for wildlife, and it looks beautiful. And this is a retention pond that it was made into a park. It was so beautiful that we put walkways through it. So again, landscape architects and designers, we need to be able to tell our clients and engineers that we work with that, hey, recommend that this retention pond have a littoral shelf. Recommend native plants be planted in it. Stop planting crepe myrtles on every single project. Think about what other native plants you can substitute for. Landscape architects have a responsibility. We're stewards of the land, and we need to show it. We need to stop planting so many non-native plants and start thinking about the future of our communities.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2. But for now, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Yes, Karina, actually we have quite a number of questions in the chat. Okay. The first question is from Karen Guerin, who would like to know if that's mulberry on the top right of your slide.
It is. That is native mulberry, and an excellent tree to plant. It doesn't have a traditional canopy, but in the springtime, it's one of the absolute favorite thing of birds is the mulberry berries.
That's right. And they taste pretty good as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Eric brings up a question about prescribed burning that came up during you discussing about how, development encroaches around our natural lands. It makes it harder to burn.
Yeah.
He says, so if the land needed regular burning to stay healthy, how do we keep our natives healthy long term without fire?
Well, the only other option is mechanical removal of the underbrush, which, in my opinion, it's very disruptive to the soils and the organisms that are there. Fire is the very best thing to do. There are some proactive developers out there that are actually doing prescribed burns right next to residential areas, and they're advertising it. They're inviting the residents out to watch. Prescribed burns are very safe. They're very controlled. They're called controlled burns. That has been very successful. I wish we could do that on a bigger scale, because people they're afraid of fire and they're afraid of smoke. But really, when you start educating people about, hey, this is preserving the habitat that you live next to, let's come out and watch it. And so that's been successful. The Nature Conservancy tells me, the biologist there, that the conditions have to be so perfect for a prescribed fire. The wind has to be a certain direction. It can't be over a certain mile per hour, and in certain areas. So when we can burn, I give kudos to those developers that are making it a learning experience and fun. There's photos, there's kids, families standing out watching the fire. And again, that's the mindset that we have to get to with that paradigm shift.
Right. And, just because burning might be challenging in a certain situation doesn't mean it can't be done. So Tall Timbers even is doing burning right along that main, I don't know if it's 98, but they did a big thing. They invited the news, and they put the road down to one lane each direction, and they burned the median. Mm-hmm. And it was to demonstrate that it could be done. So as we develop around our natural areas, we really do need more funding for FWC and all the agencies that are doing these burns, so that they can have the resources on hand so that the fire doesn't escape, and so it's safe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Eric brings up, he understands about prescribed burns, but we aren't going to be able to do that in our home lawns. So he doesn't think he can burn his lawn.
Well, you're not going to burn your lawn, because that doesn't really need burning. But I have muhly grass, a large clump of it, in my house in downtown Orlando. And after a couple of years, all of the dead stalks, it's kind of got big and bulky. And that's about the time in nature where a fire would go through and kind of clean that out. Well, I did my own prescribed burn. I had the water hose right there, and I set it on fire, and it went up, and I put it out at the right time, and it regenerated the growth. So, I mean, if you can, in making, again, it was a controlled environment. So, you can do it on small scale.
Yeah, Eric, you might be asking the wrong people, because you're talking to two people who have, in fact, lit up their... I lit up my gamma grass, and she lit up her muhly grass. So, but people have burnt their lawns. You can make a little fire line and have enough water. But yeah, I'm not sure if there are any regulations that were violated.
You need to, if it's going to be too big, you need to, talk to your city and county about it first. But it's a fantastic, if you do it in a small scale, it's a fantastic learning point of learning for your neighbors. What are you doing? Oh, here's why I'm doing this.
But yes, most native plants, you just cut them back at the times needed, and don't necessarily plant the ones that are extremely pyrogenic right next to your house, for example.
Yeah.
Or that it would be difficult to handle mechanically.
Good point.
Mechanically treat. Let's see. Aranda has a question about builders changing the soil profile. For example, when they bring in fill, does that make natives that would have been suitable to that particular site unsuitable longer?
Yes and no. It's a chronic problem, because the builder's sand, it's not fertile. It's not sandy like the native plants like. It doesn't have any of the redeeming values that native plants like. What I do is and especially if you're planting someplace next to a parking lot that was built, you can have all that limestone and everything in that'll just kill plants. So I excavate 12 to 24 inches down in the planting pit, take that soil out, put back good planting soil, good Florida recipe of planting soil, and that does help the plants better. On larger projects, landscape architects when they were grading the site, they would scrape off and save some of the native soil so that we can put it back into the project later. The problem with that, though, is when you stacked up the dirt in the construction phase, the heat from the sun killed all of the good microbes and mycorrhizae in the soil, so it was rendered useless too. So it's a constant thing, but the question is a good one, because even in your subdivision, if you want to do a native plant landscape and you've been living in or the house has been there for 15 years, that soil maybe still needs to be tested by the University of Florida. All the IFAS offices, you can bring your soil in and have it tested, and they will tell you, okay, if you want to plant native plants, here's some amelioration you can do with your soil. So I highly recommend getting the soil tested.
Okay, so people would know if they have fill dirt by
the color of it. Usually it looks more like clay. It has kind of an orangey look to it. Our native soils, we do have some clay in North Florida, but in Central Florida, there's very few clay type soils. So it's kind of yellow and oranges. You probably have some builder's sand in there.
Okay, great. And obviously if your house is on like a pad, like it looks like you've got sort of like an angle and it's sort of a square, that would be a good sign as well.
Anything up next to the foundation of any house is probably going to contain some builder's sand.
Thank you. Yeah. Rosalie asks, what do you advise using instead of mulch?
Well, the best thing you can use is pine straw mulch because it doesn't necessitate the taking down of any trees like pine bark or cypress mulch is an absolute no. It literally destroys our wetlands in Florida. If you see cypress mulch being sold, say something to the manager. But beyond pine needles, which is an excellent mulch, I don't really have any other good recommendations. Do not use rocks, lava rocks or white rocks. They build up the heat. It's not good for the plants. Don't use rocks. Don't use cypress mulch. Never use grass clippings. It just will make your weeds go haywire. So I don't know, Valerie, if you have any ideas. I mean, I don't really have any other idea other than the pine straw, which you can get naturally if you have any pine trees nearby. Mm-hmm. Also, plants love leaf litter, like in a forest on the floor. I have a live oak in my backyard, and every November and February, it's semi-deciduous, it drops a bunch of leaves. Well, I rake those up, and that's perfect mulch. So I highly recommend, if you or your neighbors have any oak trees or any other deciduous trees, that's the best native mulch you could ever use.
Yeah, I would also advise against using the plastic that you might lay down on the ground. That just becomes way more of a pain than it's worth. You're still going to have weeds, and then you have bits of stringy plastic all like in your soil, very difficult to remove. Same with the rocks. Mm-hmm. Is that, you might not want them in the future, and then you're going to be picking rocks out of your ground for, the next 10 years. The
rocks, even with filter fabric, I've been doing this 32 years, do not buy the weed fabric, the plastic that Val was talking about. It never works, and no matter how they advertise it. And the same thing with the rocks. Even if you put the filter fabric down, eventually you're going to get plants up, and the only way you can kill it is with chemicals. So, and it heats up the soil. So yeah, rocks are a bad idea.
Yeah. And the reason why you might need to mulch a large area is if you're maybe transitioning from a yard to native habitat. And in my personal experience and a lot of other people's experience, doing that step by step and expanding beds as your natives reseed or as you have the budget to buy more natives, it's really a lot easier than ripping out your lawn and putting in tons and tons of natives. Then you have to buy less mulch, less pine straw, and you have to worry less about weeds because you'll be depleting the seed bank of weeds, every time you're able to expand your bed and weed a little bit more and a little bit more.
Yeah, and the weeding wanes off after a while. Once you clear an area, like you shovel up the grass and you may have to weed, but eventually over time it'll slow down and the weeds won't be so intense. But, if you want to start a little area of your lawn as a native plant garden, Taylor Figueroa from our chapter, she recommends 3 layers of cardboard, weight it down with rocks or something, and leave it out there in the summertime for 3 months until the grass naturally dies, and then plant your native plant garden. That's a good way to start it.
Yeah, a lot of good comments in the chat about using native plants as your understory to replace, sort of as a long-term replacement for mulching.
I would like to know what plants you're using. I used Mimosa strigolosa as a ground cover under my other plants, and it crawled up the plants and it was very high maintenance, and I ended up having to take it out. It was a condominium complex, so a good list of mulch type plants. Phyllonata flora could probably be used in that capacity, although it might take over a little bit as well.
I have not had the problem with sunshine mimosa climbing, but it does kind of die back in the winter and doesn't look very robust. Santa says, my parents' home in Massachusetts has wild strawberry as a living mulch under their perennial beds.
Yeah, that would be perfect because it's low and it's spreading. That would be a perfect mulch up there.
And Diane Goldberg, who was a previous speaker on the Lunch and Learn, says, Doug Tallamy says to use leaves, but we should leave some areas without anything for solitary ground bees and for turtles to nest.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Every native plant landscape should have some kind of open soil area because that's how butterflies do not drink water. They with their proboscis take up moisture from moist soils and minerals from the soil. Yeah. So, and there's just even beyond our solitary bees, we have solitary wasps that nest in the ground too. There's a plethora of wildlife that is looking for bare soil. So, yeah, good point.
And let's see, Dana missed the beginning of the presentation, so was hopped in live later. Would like a little explanation about what this end slide is about. What's the list of species here?
This is what not to plant. The red box during the presentation, the red box means, bad, no, do not plant. I'm making the point that landscape architects, we have planted hundreds of thousands of crepe myrtles in the southeast United States. They are a monoculture of ecologically sterile trees where we could be planting the Prunus umbellata, the native plum tree that produces fruits that birds can eat. And it's multi-trunked, the same height. It blooms white in the springtime. And landscape architects need to be the stewards of our land and stop the crazy monoculture of, these types of plants in our landscapes.
That we have such a better palette to use than is currently being used.
Right, we have a much better palette. There are a handful of landscape architects that are on board with looking to provide biodiversity as well as something aesthetic for people, but it needs to be more widespread.
Mm-hmm. Santa also hopped in that they used to burn alternate halves of their half-acre meadow in Rhode Island every other year. I always had hoses ready and prearranged a burning permit with the local fire department.
Perfect.
So, someone else. Karen says, I cut liriope, desiccate it to death in a killing field, black plastic sheet under a greenhouse, and mulch with that. The resulting.
Unique idea. That sounds good.
Unique idea. Yep. Rhonda asks, I have a terrible problem with torpedo grass in my yard. Do you have any ideas?
I will tell you, if anybody knows me, I abhor any type of herbicide and I avoid it like crazy. But this one species in Florida, you cannot pick it. You cannot shovel it. It has a very long root system that has little fibers on it, and it snaps off. It could be up to like 10 feet long sometimes. You have to use chemicals on it. Consult somebody in the field the best way, but I have tried for years to mechanically remove torpedo grass, and it just doesn't work. And I've consulted with other people as well. They've had the same experience. So you need to use an herbicide on that. And the thing with torpedo grass, it is so tenacious. It'll grow in 3 feet of water, under 3 feet of water, and it'll grow up into pastures. It grows anywhere. Very tenacious. Kogon grass is kind of the same way.
It's another one. I do not like herbicide either. There's many drawbacks, but there are a few invasive species in Florida that you couldn't control them without herbicide.
Right.
Yeah. Lygodium is one. Kogon grass, torpedo grass. Yeah, you just can't. And our natural areas managers are doing a very good job with the little resources that they have taking care of these invasive
and
species.
if you do have these plants, take care of it quick.
Immediately.
It's out of control immediately. Yeah.
And if you need help identifying any of your plants, we do have that Florida Native Plant Society members only group. You can drop them in there, and I check that group pretty often, can help you with IDs. Or iNaturalist is also a good source for IDs. So if something new does pop up in your yard, please keep an eye, because you don't want to be the source of the next invasive species. Like a teacher just down in Miami, she was out hiking and she saw the new black bean beetle, invasive pest. And so she was the first sighting in that county because she kept an eye out and noticed some damage on sea grape. So you really could be finding something that's really important to report. Diane Goldberg says, please check the University of Florida's IFAS EDIS website for helping get rid of torpedo grass. That's a very good suggestion. That's EDIS. You can just Google UF EDIS and search, or UF EDIS torpedo grass, and that should get you there with herbicide recommendations. We get a lot of questions every time. So one of the reasons why I stream this to YouTube Live is that means that our videos are live DVR'd. You can, right now, you can go back, if your screen says live in the bottom left, you can go back and watch the presentation from the beginning right now, or as soon as we're done, or tomorrow, and it's the same link. So that's one of the benefits to the way that I'm doing these presentations now. And a lot of thanks in the chat. So, do you have anything else to add, Karina?
Nothing to add. I'm glad to be associated with such like-minded people.
Yeah, and thank you for your time, Karina, and for presenting. I appreciate, despite the technical issues. So, anyways, Karina is the president of the Pine Lily chapter, which is my chapter here in Osceola County, and I really appreciate her expertise, and she's a fantastic landscape architect, and really like her leadership here in Osceola County.
Thank you.
All right, I hope everyone enjoyed the Lunch and Learn, and we'll have Karina back on next week for part 2.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.